Next question, please. Who's coming?
During the last year, have you been in the gallery of Tyndall, and where do you get your news from?
Nice one, interesting. Have you been in Tyndall and where do you get your news from?
Thank you. Unfortunately, I haven't been to public gallery, so that the nature of my job, obviously teaching at present, means I'm not able to get in during sittings. I've been a keen follower of kind of match politics since I was at university, and I keep, try to keep abreast of developments, obviously in the local press, the local media, but I also make use of the Tyndall website, which is absolutely excellent in terms of the Listen Again features. So you can listen to entire sittings, you can listen to specific aspects of the sitting. I think somebody else has already mentioned that obviously the Hansard extracts are on there, which are the kind of verbatim statements of what was said in the House. So for me, that's how I like to try and engage with it, because I say unfortunately the day job I'm in doesn't permit me time to keep the microphone working or get to the public gallery.
Thank you.
Yes, I have, but again, because of my job, as opposed to being having the time to go on my own stead, it is quite interesting to see how Tyndall work operates, and I'm fascinated by the process. I've not seen how Ledgecote works. I've not been into the gallery there, but in earlier years I've been into gallery of keys, because I am and have always been quite interested in Manx politics and the news. So where do I get my news from? Well, I get my news from Radio 4 first thing in the morning, then Manx Radio shortly after that, and then reading the local newspapers. I will occasionally listen to the music on Energy or 3FM and also listen to their news as well. And I also get it from Facebook or any of the other outlets of finding out what's going on in the Isle of Man. So where do I get my news from? A large range of sources, but actually probably my preferred is radio, listening to what people have said, listening to people's words rather than what's written there.
Thank you very much. Yes, I've been in the gallery. Honestly, I wish all more people would come. I mean, it's a real shame that so often there's only a handful, if not anyone in the gallery. So I'd like to see ways to bring more people to engage with our Parliament. I think that does perhaps change how the way people behave, to be honest, if more people came. Where I get the news from? Well, clearly Jeff the Mongoose is great. One does an amazing job as well. With not many resources, I have to say. I think he does a great job. The whole Manx media pack, but I enjoy reading the newspapers on Sunday. It's just a bit of a treat for me. Go to the conservatory, lots of coffee, and I read the big papers from cover to cover, really. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I haven't because of work commitments, but like the others, I think social media, the radio, I do listen to the Man in Line every lunchtime. I love that. I think that really is it's what people are talking about, and I do like Mandate on a Monday night too, which I missed, because we were travelling here. So, but I also do read Hansard. I really, and have done for about 8 years, and catch up with what's been going on a Tuesday.
Yes, I have been fortunate enough to observe from the gallery, and like Bill, I think it's a real shame that more people don't attend. Perhaps we should start charging admission, and more people might feel they're missing something and go along and observe. Where do I get news from? At the risk of incurring the wrath of the journalists here tonight, I'm not sure how much news is actually out there these days. There's a hell of a lot of opinion. There's not a great deal of news. So yes, I do listen to the news on the radio, watch TV, read the newspapers. However, personally I would say I get most of my news from discussion with friends, with colleagues. You're going to get opinion anyway. So I'd rather have the opinions of people that I know and trust and whose opinions I know differ from mine, as opposed to somebody else's opinion that I don't know. So it's more from hearsay and talking to colleagues.
I, as well, haven't had the opportunity to get to the gallery yet, but I was hoping to do tomorrow, 10:30, sharp. But in terms of news, I get most of mine online, and I get it through all different social media forums. Also, I have a weird hobby of liking to read the order paper to see what questions are getting asked. I'm just sort of curious what the House of Keys are thinking is relevant, or what people are wanting to get achieved within their constituencies. So those are sort of the areas I like. And I do like reading the social media, and I do like reading the comments, because sometimes there's points of view that I would never know were there. So it's actually kind of nice to kind of get sort of that side debate as well.
And I haven't been in the Tynwald Chamber personally over the last 12 months, but I've been there online many a time following the debates going through. One of the wonders of having hearing aids which link to your phone is that you can use that as a radio. So I can go anywhere and have Manx Radio broadcasting the Tynwald debates in my ears. I was in the Keys last week. There were only two members of the public in there at that, so I understand that the comment that sometimes there are very few people there. But I follow very closely what they're doing. I'll sometimes pick up Hansard, especially if I've seen something in the order papers or the question papers in Tynwald coming up that are of interest. I'll follow through when the Hansard comes out, and I'm still engaged in research. I make my own notes on it. Where do I get my news from? I do listen to some off-island news. I read the Times daily, which doesn't follow my politics, but I find it good writing. I like Radio 4. But I listen an awful lot to Manx Radio and the other radio stations. I follow the local papers. I follow Jeff the Mongoose as well, and I've written some things for them. So I keep well up to date with what's going on through those media. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's good. You've been having your concerts. Is that everyone? Yeah. Yeah, really good. Fine, another question? Yeah?
I would like to ask a question.
Just go with that.
Avoid the feedback.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you are elected, you will be in a position of influence. Now, if the microphone.
Don't hold it too close to your mic. Hold it further away, I think. Oh, actually, it sounds like the battery might be dead. Just you have to yell.
I think so. Okay, let me move. Perhaps it works. Okay, let's get to the chase. If you'll be in a position of influence, and if you had your way, what one policy, legislative or constitutional change would you like to see if you were elected? Because we've been talking in generalities about procedures, about scrutiny, whether you're going to be on a department or not. But we want to know more about you, what motivates you, what passions and drives you have underneath. What one policy, legislative or constitutional change would you like to see if you were elected? Thank you.
Okay. Diane, you're first up.
Now that is a good question. I didn't think I was going to say that tonight. I had a joke with my husband earlier. Well, interestingly, one of the things that I think comes together with quite a lot that's been going on over the last couple of months as well, especially with COP. I think I'd like to understand a little bit more about our transport policies, and therefore understand why we might give free transport to some and not to others. I think that would be something I'd be very keen to influence and understand. We're very lucky on the island, we've got decent transport, especially public transport, but why is it we give some people free public transport and others not? So I think that's what I would look to do if I was able to influence. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, I'm passionate about developing our brownfield sites, which are blotting our towns throughout the island, and I moved. Moulton set up a select committee, which I then chaired, and one of the outcomes of that was the formation of the Manx Development Corporation, which I'm delighted is now looking at its first site. And I think that will really help lift Douglas, and I think it will also help with the housing crisis that we have. So I'd be pleased to continue to support that, because I think we're really missing a trick there. I'm also interested in the community infrastructure levy, which is, both of these are agreed policies, and that I think if it could be implemented effectively, then I think that would help redress the balance between brownfield and greenfield sites, so that we stop concreting over the max countryside and start looking at the empty lot sites that we have in towns.
Did you mention active travel there? So it's unusual getting your bike. Okay, up to the top you go.
I think I would look at infrastructure projects, and I know the capital projects unit has been discussed. It seems to have gone silent. What are they doing with DOI? And if you look at our major capital projects, we won't mention the prom, but let's mention the prom. We've got the landing station, St Mary's School, MSC. There's not a capital project that's actually gone on time and to budget. So I think I would love to get involved in that, actually.
Well, in the first instance, I'll give the politician's answer and say I'd hate to only change one policy because they're so interconnected that I think in changing one, you potentially overlook a lot of other areas. However, you did ask the question, what policy, Damien, so I will answer that. It's not something about which I am passionate, but I think it's something that's fundamental to the future well-being of the island, and that is our taxation policy. And I don't mean taxation of us, the individuals, I mean our global taxation policy. With my background, it's something that I really want to have the ability to influence and to move us into the 21st century, to be seen as a leader in a sustainable and moral tax system. It's not going to be easy, but I would love to see us moving forward with that and having a taxation system that is seen as the envy of the other international financial centres out there.
I have the opportunity to work with a lot of young adults, and let me tell you, Islandman, you are producing some fantastic, fantastic young people. What I'd like to do is to try to figure out how to keep them here. I'd like to figure out how do we give them jobs, careers, and futures here where they feel like they can be part of our community and grow with it. This summer, we had a couple of staff members who had to make decisions between commuting from Douglas down to Port Erin or staying in a camper van. Because if they were trying to get an apartment, there were 30 applications. My whole point is that we have so much potential, and we put the hard work in, we put it in the education, and the way that they're raised here, we just need to figure out how to keep them here. And that would be sort of the policy area that I'd like to stay in and get involved with.
Thank you.
The one piece of legislation that I would like to see changing is linked to a raft of other legislation changes that would need to be made. I'm passionate about the island's population. I'm hugely aware of how vulnerable it is. I lived through the latter part of the 50s when we lost 12.5% of the population over 10 years. I lived through the 70s when by 1976, we had 17% of the population here had moved here within 5 years. So I've seen the decline, I've seen the growth, I've seen everything in between. Where we're at now, we had in 10 years a 35% decline in births. We're into the top oldest 6 countries on the planet. And we lost 40% of our 20 to 29-year-olds moved away between the last 2 censuses. We're waiting to see what the next census comes. And this is an area that absolutely needs to be tackled, and you can break it down into many, many component parts. The one I would therefore pick on is, and the number of people in the Isle of Man telling me that the cost of the care for children is massive. In the UK now, and everybody's getting not means tested 30 hours a week during term time free childcare. That doesn't happen here. I've had young people in the Isle of Man telling me that if they weren't banks, they'd be moving away now. They'd be part of that outward movement. I think it's absolutely critical we stem this and address these issues, beginning, I think, with the supporting young families in childcare so that they can continue to have families.
So is that a social justice point? Just to clarify, is that a social justice point? that needs to be addressed?
The social justice point is the issue of young families here. The way it was put to me, I spoke to one young teacher about 6 weeks ago now who described how her entire wage was going for the childcare for her 2 children, a 1-year-old and 3-year-old. Her entire wage and all her take-home pay was being swallowed up with this because they had to start early in the day and finish later. I contrast that with what's happening in England at the moment with these 30 hours a week. So the social justice issue is a difference between the 2 jurisdictions.
Thank you. As someone with 2 small children at the moment, I can certainly clarify Paul's point that the cost of children is very high. For me personally, my kind of pet legislation, if you like, or would be the education bill starting up again. So obviously that was something at the forefront. It's been talked about for the last couple of years. It's been part of public consultation. It's been sent back. It's been a couple of times, and then for whatever reasons, in terms of timescales and stuff, it's run out. I don't like the phrase not fit for purpose, but our current education bill is from 2001. There's a lot of changes that have gone on in society, a lot of changes that have gone on in schools which aren't reflected in that Education Act as it stands at the moment. For me, our schools are kind of a microcosm of our society. Any of the issues and problems that we have in society are prevalent in schools. And if we can solve them and crack those problems in schools, I think that makes the society a better place for us in general. So for me, it would certainly be a reformed Education Act.
Okay, thanks. That's it, wasn't it? That's well done. Good. I think we should give Sam a question, if you don't mind. Is that all right? So you probably have a news if you give Sam one. Start with Bill. Yeah.
Pretty quick one, I suppose then. Would you support a public inquiry into COVID?
Here. Yes, I would, because I think it's been such an enormous impact and event on the island. If you look at what previous public inquiries have been for, they're actually relatively minor in terms of the scope of the code inquiry. What I would say though is it needs to be done constructively and look at it from all aspects. But I think there's a number of learnings, and I think we may well, we hope that we'll never have another pandemic, but we may be faced with another one. So actually I think there's a lot of reasons why you would have one. The reasons why you wouldn't have is basically cost. And I think it probably would be worthwhile in terms of value for money. I think you would need to make sure the cost doesn't escalate, so it doesn't become multi-millions. So I think that's the key, really, having a meaningful public inquiry which doesn't cost us.
And now or a bit later? Now would be the time, you think, or give it a year or so?
I think somewhere now or in the near future would be my view. I think the longer you leave it, the less important it will seem to be. I think would be my view. So I would keen to see something happen. I would support a public inquiry, but not 5 million. I think 1 is probably realistic for a proper public inquiry.
Good luck. Always just get it done. All right, thank you very much indeed. Coming up.
Actually, no, I wouldn't support a public inquiry. I think it's a complete waste of money. I think hindsight's great, looking back, and I actually think that our government did a tremendous job and worked incredibly hard during that time. And no, I don't think so at all. I think they should be congratulated for what they did.
I would agree with Corelli there. I wouldn't support a public inquiry. In my time in business, I've tried to engender a no-blame culture. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no responsibility. You should always make people take responsibility for and accountability for their actions. But in my experience, events like this typically turn into witch hunts, and it's very easy with 2020 hindsight to question things that were done. I fully support the review. I think it's absolutely vital to avoid repeating mistakes, that we learn from what's done, but we cannot look back and use information now to second-guess decisions that were made at the time. I agree that, compared to everything else, our government did a tremendous job. Could it have been better? Absolutely. But was it the right thing at the time? I believe so. And I don't believe that a public inquiry would be valid for money.
Thank you. Okay.
I think this question looks at two questions really. It's acting in the interest of the public and then to be seen acting in the interest of the public. And I think an inquiry of some independent nature definitely will help that latter view of it being seen that we're acting in the interest of the public. There's so much learning to be done. And it doesn't seem like, it seems plausible that we could always have another type of pandemic or some other type of highly disruptive sort of incident that affects global logistics, travel, everything. So from my point of view, I think 5 million we can do a lot of other things with on the island. But I do believe that we should talk about it pretty soon. We should let people feel like they have some engagement, they can be involved, and we should be sort of make sure that we take thoughtful feedback from it and try to figure out how to move forward with that.
Thank you.
There's clearly need for an inquiry, and a substantial inquiry, a meaningful inquiry. Absolutely agree with that. But in the position we're currently at in COVID, and it's not all over yet. You know, we've got a way to go going forward. We've still got. I had links with Sierra Leone, and I know they're running at less than 2% of the population being infected, and less than 1% have been vaccinated. We're going to see this echo coming out of some of the poorest countries on the planet for some time to come. And therefore my concern is not so much the cost, which yeah, it sounds daunting, it's the speed of it. You know, if a public inquiry is going to take 3 years before it gets to fruition, we'll not learn very much in it until we see a final report when we've continued to make the same mistakes perhaps. So I would be very keen to see something quicker than that. And therefore I'd have to think long and hard before saying, yes, let's go for a full public inquiry, 5 million, 2 years or something. That side of it, the slowness of it, would concern me. We've still got lessons to learn that we can apply now.
Connor. Thank you. Yes, I would certainly be in favour of some sort of review to see perhaps where mistakes were made and where lessons could be learned for future kind of disaster and emergency planning, if you like. I think in the context, the last 18 months, just over 18 months, it has been absolutely unprecedented. So I think that largely the response was positive. So as I say, whilst I would support some sort of review, I don't think a public inquiry would be correct. I think that money could be better spent elsewhere. Not just the money aspect of it, but the time as well. So the kind of officers' time and everyone's time involved with that, I think could be better spent on other areas of kind of development. I'm not totally convinced that the means will justify the ends and the results. I think a few people have touched upon as well is where do we start and end with this? There's a danger we could end up throwing good money after bad. If we are a year down the line and something else happens, do we then restart an inquiry? Do we call for a new inquiry? I just think it could be potentially massive. So as I say, I'm not convinced that the means will justify the ends.
Thank
you. You need to learn from experience. You need to be reviewing all the time, and it might be something you did this morning. It might be something you did last year. It might be something you did 10 years ago. I think from a straightforward perspective, you need to be able to look back and say, what did we do right, but more importantly, what did we do wrong that we want to make sure we don't do wrong again. So I don't think that's a public inquiry, but I do believe the public have got to have a voice in any review that takes place. That's it.
Okay, that's everyone. And you've got a question there?
Just looking around the room, anybody with their hand up? If not, I'll ask a question.
And then we'll sort of wrap it, but I've got a couple as well to do, but after you, we'll go.
Okay. Many of you will know, on the back of the COVID issue, the question of civil liberties gained prominence in the media. A leading advocate, Ian Kermode, raised a number of concerns in that regard. Do you, as candidates for Legislative Council, have any concerns about civil liberties and how we might improve the situation, or maybe you think it's satisfactory. Thank you.
Just thinking.
Yeah, always hard doing for this.
In summary?
Just summarise one.
In simple terms, the question of civil liberties on the Isle of Man has been called into question. I gave an example of a leading advocate who has written about this in the media, and of course there's been commentary. For example, 71 people were sent to prison because of breaches of the coronavirus regulations. So the question is whether our civil liberties position is something that needs to be addressed and improved, or perhaps you think it does not?
I think the 71 people, I mean that was such unprecedented. It's not a big enough word. At that time, the island, the world was in panic. I remember bringing the shopping in and spraying it with domestos. It was total paranoia. I think the police following the coach loading to cope, all of it amounted to. It was just truly awful. However, I can understand why it happened. And I don't think we'll ever get to that point again. I just think it was just a different time. We're only 18 months down the road, but look at us. We're all sitting next to each other. It's so different, isn't it? Those early days when panic setting, and it was panic. So.
Okay, good question.
The question then is whether the law protected people, because the point about civil liberties, which is of course a reflection of law, is that it shouldn't be subject to that panic, as you put it.
Yes.
This is the view of those that criticise, but you're suggesting it's about different times, and that's something that we need to take into account. But I think the broader issue about civil liberties is the question.
Right, moving on. Right.
Yeah, I mean, civil liberties is a very important topic and not something that can be glossed over. It's important that it's questioned and raised at times like that, and that is something that, going back to the public inquiry question, there needs to be a review of what was done. I don't personally believe that it could necessarily have been done any differently or any better. And I think what has to be recognised here as well is that civil liberties aren't just about the individual, it's about the liberties of the population as a whole and the well-being of the island's population. And what people need to appreciate is if you want civil liberties, then you have personal responsibilities. And if we look at those individuals who are claiming that their civil liberties were impinged in any way, did they uphold their personal responsibilities, or were they riding roughshod over other people's civil liberties? So it is important, but I don't believe that there was anything wrong with what was done.
Okay, MaryBeth.
One of the most interesting things that was said to me during the war, during the early days, was a woman who was in her 90s, and she said, "Well, at least we're not getting bombed. I'm just getting asked to stay at home." And I think that was sort of the mentality that a lot of us were willing to undertake, was that this is for the common good, this is collectivism, and we're willing to make some sacrifices for the greater good. And from my point of view, it's great that we have people challenging whether or not our civil liberties were impended upon, but at the end of the day, we didn't know how long this was going to go on for. We didn't know what the actual long-term ramifications are going to be. We still kind of don't. But we were all willing, for the most part, to pitch in and make sure that we could look after one another. And I think that was what's probably more important coming out of this debate.
Cool.
Thank you. I see that the civil liberties issue as being very, very wide. Okay, you mentioned a specific example in relation to using prison in relation to COVID. And I'm sure you get different views of that within the community, because in some ways it was those strong measures taken that kept COVID out for so long here at a given period. But let's broaden it out and look at it more than that, and perhaps look at the way that the island's on a journey, really. I think there's a journey into issues of abuse that perhaps in the past were covered more than opened up, issues in relation to inclusivity and equality, these areas of civil liberty. I welcome Craig's comment that with civil liberties go responsibilities, that's undoubtedly there. But I would see us on a journey on this, and I think the whole community has to come with you on it, so it's a big issue. It's interesting to hear, I haven't seen the article you referred to, but it's interesting to hear that one of the advocates has been looking at that area. But I think it's a huge issue, and I think we've got some movement in the right direction.
Thank you. As I said, framing within the context of kind of COVID, I was chatting to a GP on Friday who said he qualified 31 years ago and he's never seen a situation with an illness like that that's had so many variables. So I think it's important that the context is applied to it. The decisions and things that were made last year were made on a medical basis from people with more expertise than certainly myself and sort of layman, sort of people from a medical point of view. In terms of it, I see it more as a kind of the management and enforcement of those rules of last year rather than kind of an invasion on civil liberties. At the end of the day, even within the emergency powers, everything was underpinned by a legal framework still. So if anybody was arrested, it was because they broke the law. Whether or not you agree with that law is a different question, but there was a legal framework which was still underpinning everything at the time. So for me, it's more a question around the management and enforcement of those legal frameworks at the time, as opposed to it being an attack on civil liberties. I think where we are as an island, I think we actually benefit from really positive and quite good civil freedom, actually.
Okay, Diane.
Well, it's a little bit going back to Andy's question about plain English. I think there aren't problems with sort of civil liberties on the Isle of Man, but we need to make sure that our laws are clear so people understand which side of the law they're on, and if they break the law, then there will be some consequences. So if we're just talking about legislation, then I think it just needs to be more understandable, clearer, and easy to follow. If we're talking about broader issues of making sure, keeping people out of the Isle of Man when we had an emergency in it, whether it be COVID or anything else, I think that sometimes there's needs must, but we need to be certain that we're accountable if we make those decisions, because removing anybody's liberty for whatever, whether it be they can't travel or they go to prison, it's pretty serious stuff, and they shouldn't be unlikely, and I don't believe they were unlikely over the last 18 months, but we have to uphold that and make it easy for people to follow the law and understand the law.
And Bill? Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating question, and I think we came pretty close to crossing some lines in terms of civil liberties. Yeah. And I had a number of constituents who could tell you some really toe-curling stories, frankly, about what happened to them. However, what I would say is generally we're in a good position on civil liberties, but we are in a small democracy here. We should not take it for granted. And I actually see it's a really important role for the Legislative Council, because the executive here has considerable power, as they do in most small jurisdictions. So the Legislative Council does need to be a balancing role, along with other members of the board. So we all have a responsibility to safeguard our civil liberties, and we should not take it for granted. I'm really concerned about some responsibility there, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking at the time, I'm just going to do a quick question for me and a quick answer, and then we'll give you a minute or so to wrap to say something. So we'll start with you this time. Have you got political aspirations? And I ask that because we have this slide actually, because we have two MLCs who decided they want to be politicians. What's your views? Have you got political ambitions?
It's a very simple question, Paul. None whatsoever. And that's why I'm standing for LegCo rather than for the House of Keys. I have no desire to be an MHK. I don't want to be a minister. What I want to do is to be involved in government, in helping with the legislation. So I have a role to play, but it is definitely not a political aspiration. My hand goes out to those guys. I couldn't do what they do.
I too don't have political aspirations in that realm. My legal background makes me more drawn to the role of an MLC. Also, my accent might be a little hard to carry a constituency, but nonetheless, I do feel that my skills and my qualification and my understanding of how the local economy here works makes me a really good candidate for an MLC.
No, not in the sense of the questions being asked.
It's quite good for you though, isn't it? Sorry, obviously you will, because you have tried.
I have tried, yes.
So,
I stood for the House of Keys twice. Some people would say I shouldn't therefore be permitted an opportunity to serve on Legislative Council.
And your answer is?
Well, I understand what people are saying, I understand what they're thinking when they say that. But I would say, first of all, when I stood in 2016, I got 1,090 votes. I got more votes than a quarter of the people who were elected. If I'd been in an election like Guernsey with an all-island vote, I'd have been in on that. So I did well. Many people said there were 3 strong candidates in middle, and that if I'd stood in any one of half a dozen other constituencies, I'd have been elected. So I would say that. But the deal with my long-suffering wife was that I'd have 2 attempts, and if the door didn't open at the second attempt, I wouldn't carry on any further. So I have no ambitions of returning or getting into the Keys. My ambitions, I think I would say, are restricted to some outcomes. I want to see outcomes in relation to what's going on in relation to population, something dear to my heart. I want to see us taking real steps forward and reducing emissions on climate change. And I want to see some real outcomes that support our younger people, outcomes that see our minimum wage reach a living wage. So I'm keen to see some outcomes. So yes, I've got some political ambitions, but not personal ones, outcomes.
Okay, Connor.
Thank you. At this point, absolutely not. I don't sit here today as a kind of frustrated MHK trying to get through the back door. As a couple of other people touched upon, the skill set that I have at the moment and for the position I'm in, and the roles I have within my work lend itself to that kind of scrutiny element. And my eyes are open to that. So I would never say never to anything. I wouldn't like to rule myself in or out of anything. But at this position, certainly not. I know what this role is. I know what this role is about. I believe I have the skills for this role at present. And that's where I stand on things.
No political with a capital P, but I have to accept that standing for this sort of role, that there's quite a bit of political with a small p. So quite similar to Paul's comment, I'm expecting to be involved in political discussion, debate, and then supporting people making decisions. In some cases, making decisions as well for myself. But no, I have no ambitions to move from one to the other.
Obviously, signed in for you, Bill.
Thanks, Paul. And I guess this is a bit of a strange question, because I would argue everyone sitting around this table has political ambitions, because this is a political role. An MLC is a politician in the Isle of Man, and MLCs have a vote on a whole raft of important issues. So I think we all have political ambitions. I am not able to commit for a 5-year term, so at present, as things stand, I will not be standing for MHK or for MLC in 2023. But in politics, you should never say never. So who knows long term? But at this moment in time, my absolute ambition is to try and help this next administration deliver real change quickly for the people of Elman. Thank you.
I want to go then. I've like a minute wrap. Just you give them a warning. Is that all right? Time-wise, yeah. So, you just lose that question. Political ambitions?
No, I've got no ambitions of going into Keys. I think the 2 roles are really different, and my skill set's definitely suited towards the MLC side as opposed to Keys.
Thank you very much, Steve. So, just before we do the wrap, we'll start with you, Beth. Yeah, MaryBeth. Thank you again for coming, and we have got some decision makers in this room tonight, which is interesting, isn't it? People in this room will have listened. They have their own hustings later this week, but it's interesting to see what you've all said. Thank you for coming. Let's hear your final pitch, as they say. Have a minute. Thank you.
Thanks again for coming, everybody. From my discussions with the MHKs and MLCs and in this really interesting and unique process, I have distilled three elements that I understand they're expecting for the role. One is to apply rigorous review of legislation. Two is to engage in scrutiny. And three, to provide constructive feedback on potential or unintended consequences. In my experience, this is all things that I've done. I'm very comfortable with all these elements because I've practiced them in law. But mainly, I understand how law touches people and how important it is, especially to everybody from a person newly coming to a country to a big corporation. Law is so fundamental to the way we live, and we abide by it unconsciously. And so from my point of view, I think we really want to work on getting the best version of legislation possible when we take on this role.
Thank you, Steve. Paul?
Thank you. One of the items in the job description for the Legislative Council is that they are to provide a distinct and influential voice in political life on the island based on an understanding and experience of island life. I would say in excess of 60 years that I've been a resident in the Isle of Man, I've developed very considerable understanding and experience of island life. I can remember the period I mentioned before when the population has dropped and when the population has risen. I can remember some of the economic difficulties we've been in. I can remember the Director of Education going around the schools telling them that there'd be no spending on education because we were down to the last 3 weeks of government expenditure in the reserves. That was the mid-1980s. So I've got a background, and I've been through all of that, I've lived through all of that. And I bring a skill set together that would be distinctive because I'm not coming from the finance sector or business, and I've got professional skills of scrutiny, great attention to detail, and very comfortable with data.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Yes, thanks again for your time this evening and for giving us the opportunity to answer your questions. I certainly see it as a role I can evolve in if selected. As I say, I'm not looking back retrospectively trying to impart knowledge that I've gained throughout my working career or other kind of life experience. I think with the experience I've got, I represent a different view to what's currently in council, and that I think can't be underestimated. As I say, I'm a graduate professional, and I'm going through massive problems trying to get a house. I experience problems with childcare. I see all those kind of frontline problems from a slightly different perspective. And I feel that the contribution I can add to the discussions around that can only improve the island for us all going forward. So it was just a final thank you for your time as well.
Thank you, Diane.
And thank you for some good questions and for taking the time to come and listen to us. Genuinely, I do believe that our upper house or the LegCo should be doing the scrutiny and taking the time and energy and diligence to make sure that if anything's been missed or anything can be misunderstood, that we actually feed that back into the system and make the changes and the amendments that are needed. From my perspective, I think that in my background, I'm an engineer by background, but also regulations in the Air Force and the current role I play as well, it's quite important not to get things wrong. Will I get everything right? Absolutely not. But will I be working to make sure we get very good law on the Isle of Man for everybody, that everyone can follow and understand to right? Thank you.
Thank you for all the good questions. And I can bring my previous experience, both intermode and outside in the commercial world, to this role. I can fully engage from day one. I should not underestimate the number of board decisions will now be made, probably this intermode, January and February intermode. So I'm really hoping that I can help over the next 15 months provide best practice, diligence, rigour, scrutiny to achieve better outcomes, because that's what we're all here to do. That's effectively what delivers good value for the next taxpayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we go?
Yes, thank you all again for coming tonight. I've never classed myself as political, but I care about what goes on around me, and therefore, Bill, you're right. We are all political sitting in this panel. For me, I like to do the right thing. I like to fix things that are broken, and I like to work. That's what makes me sleep soundly at night, and I have the time, energy, and experience to excel in the role. I promise you, I will earn my keep.
Oh, great.
Well, I understand that one of the aims of the Positive Action Group is to increase the interaction between the general public and government. And I would say you've succeeded tonight with some people here who are putting themselves forward for this. And I'm greatly encouraged by the strength in depth that I've heard with the fellow candidates here. So I'm confident that the big shoes that Bill mentioned earlier will be filled. From a personal perspective, I'm somebody that can work collaboratively. I'm capable of interpreting and implementing legislation, and I'm about focusing on the people. When I look back at my career, the thing of which I'm most proud is that I feel that every role that I've fulfilled, I've left in a better state than when I started it. And so what I'm looking at here is precisely that. In 15 months' time, or in 2 terms' time, I'd like to look back and feel that it's in a better shape than today.
Well, that's it, and I hope that's been of interest. And can you show support for all our panelists, please?